Welcome, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. We've got members of the Diplomatic Corps here, representatives of the UN. My name's Penny Matthew and I hold the Freilich Foundation chair here. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this public forum that we're hosting with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees office here in Canberra. And I'd particularly like to thank Rick Towle for asking us to host this event with UNHCR and our 5 distinguished panellists who I'll introduce in a moment. Before we commence, I want to acknowledge that we meet on Ngunnawal land. I acknowledge the first Australians as the traditional custodians of this continent, whose cultures are amongst the oldest living cultures in human history. I pay respect to the elders of the community and extend my recognition to their descendants who are present tonight. In a moment, after a short introduction from me, I will ask each of the 5 panellists to speak for around 5 minutes. I will then ask some questions of the panel to get the conversation going, and then it will be the audience's turn to ask some questions, because this is the idea of a public forum. The only ground rules are that we're all polite to each other. The questioners try to keep their questions short, and I, as chair, will ruthlessly cut you off if I think you've gone too long. All right, so the first speaker here tonight is Rick Towle, who is the regional representative of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees for Australia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea and the Pacific. Before taking up that role in 1997, he served UNHCR in many capacities, including Chief of Mission in Belgrade and Yugoslavia between 2001 and 2003, as Senior Human Rights Officer at the Department of International Protection in Geneva between 1997 and 2001, Regional Protection Officer in the UK from 1994 to 1997, and he also worked in many capacities with the UN in Hong Kong from 1992 to 1994, and he's been a decision maker on refugee status in both Hong Kong and New Zealand. So he has a wealth of experience and he is our co-host, so I'd like to welcome him to the podium to speak. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Penny. Just for the record, I haven't been here since 1997. If I had been here, that would have been far too long, I think, even for our patient government hosts. It's really a great pleasure to be here. Thank you to the Freilich Foundation for not only appointing Penny, which I think was a masterful choice, given Penny's impeccable pedigree in protecting and promoting refugee issues, but allowing us to have what I think is an extremely important discussion at a critical moment or critical juncture in Australia's pathway on refugee and protection. Thank you to the fellow panellists and to distinguished members of the Diplomatic Corps, our friends, and to Christopher Woodthorpe from United Nations. It's great to have you all here this evening. I'm going to steal 2 extra minutes of the +5, Penny, because I'm hosting it, so I'm going to abuse that. There cannot be, I would suggest, a more challenging and emotive debate on any social issue in Australia at present than the swirling debate around refugees, asylum, and boats. And what I hope today's forum today would be to look beyond the politics and the politicking to see what it is in the Australian community that permits the kinds of policies that exist or is acquiescing in the kinds of politics that exist today. It seems to us, and I've been here 5.5 years, that at the heart of the public debate lies an intrinsic sense of the fair go, which I think as a New Zealander we also share with ordinary Australians. I'm convinced that many people genuinely are concerned by the desperation and plight of others, and that the 15 million refugees that UNHCR is responsible for globally genuinely elicit a response of compassion amongst ordinary people. When you see those images on television, in the stories of Syria today, you cannot help but be moved. But I would also suggest that going along with that is a sense of powerlessness to help in the face of such overwhelming numbers and such overwhelming need. So the question really is, what do we do with that intrinsic sense of fair go when faced with the powerlessness? Where does one invest a sense of compassion and a sense of fair play? Where does that reside within the tools and strength and power that we have as individuals and communities to make a difference? And it seems to me that is really the crucible of the debate that exists in Australia today. Asylum and refugee protection for us as the International Protection Agency is a humanitarian act built on a very sound and proud pedigree of human rights, humanitarianism, protection, compassion. It is not like ordinary migration. It is probably the greatest exception to ordinary managed migration that you could possibly hope to find in the hierarchy of international relations between states. The greatest exception to border management and the sanctity and integrity of state sovereignty is an acknowledgement freely given by states that if you turn up at the frontiers of a country and ask for protection, you should be allowed to seek that protection and to be protected if you need it. So the notion of a fair go and the sense of justice, in my view, and this is a personal reflection, tends now in this current environment in Australia to pitch two vulnerable groups of people against each other. On the one hand, we have those who come through orderly managed refugee resettlement programs, which is akin to the expectation that people coming across borders come in a managed and orderly way. That is a discretionary program that this government and previous governments have been proud to subscribe to, and we're grateful for the way that many thousands of people have been able to find long-term safety and security through managed resettlement programs. That manner of arrival, being managed, coherent, invited, is pitched against those who come in an irregular way by boat, claiming asylum at the frontiers of the territory and claiming in their aid the Refugee Convention, which lies at the heart of the asylum. The challenge, as I see it in Australia today, is a pitching between two equally deserving groups of people who are now, in some zero-sum game, obliged to compete in the same territory of compassion and support. The notion of fair go, I would suggest, propagates notions such as queue jumping and recently the no advantage test, which plays into the idea that there are illegal and irregular and unexpected and unwelcome ways of coming to this country, and regular, welcomed, managed and compassionate ways of people coming through a managed resettlement program. This narrative now tends, in our view, to create a fictional construct between legitimate, or what I would call good refugees, and illegitimate and what one could call bad refugees who have, for whatever reasons, put their fates into the hands of illegal people smugglers and are using illegal and irregular ways of moving into the territory of Australia. So what for us should be an instrument of protection and humanitarianism has changed asylum to something that is frequently condemned, deterred, or even punished. I would call this an emerging idea of the politics of deterrence, where asylum and the Refugee Convention are increasingly sidelined in the pursuit of border management, border security. The antidote being, in terms of the compassion of the receiving host community, being a managed refugee resettlement program. The profound problem that this creates, in my personal view, is that this forces the host society, ordinary Australians, to choose which is the more deserving of help and on whom to bestow the gift of compassion. The reality for UNHCR is somewhat different for that paradigm that has now become well established here in Australia. For us, refugee movement is not by nature and definition an orderly, managed program. To be a refugee means to move in an irregular, chaotic, dangerous and unmanaged way. If the building is burning, you get out of the building. You don't wait for the front door to be open for you to get out, and you don't wait for somebody else's front door to be open for you to be invited in. You do what you can to get away, and you do what you can to get in. And that is the nature of asylum today. That has always been the nature of asylum, and it is why it is such a major exception to the international rules relating to the sovereignty of states and the management of borders. So it's strange to us that intrinsic reality of refugee displacement has somehow been recharacterized as a criminal undertaking underpinned by criminal activities of people exploiting shamelessly those who are already victims. The other reality that we operate with is that resettlement is not an appropriate panacea or substitute or surrogate for refugee protection through asylum and the Convention. Resettlement is only ever a tiny pool, a tiny resource for the international community to find safety and protection for a very small number of the far larger group of very, very vulnerable individuals globally. We estimate that there are about 750,000 of the 15 million refugees. 750,000 of those people are living in such desperate situations in far-flung places of this planet that they need protection that can only be achieved through resettlement today. Of that group, there are about 200,000 people who are acutely in need of protection as we speak. They are living in dire situations in refugee camps, in urban areas around the world. Women, heads of household who are acutely vulnerable without any support systems around them. Of that 200,000 people, the combined number of places of all of the resettlement countries on the world today is 80,000 or less. So there is a massive gap between the number of available resettlement places and the acute protection needs for people. And to suggest, as many do, that somehow those acutely in need of international refugee protection that can only be found through resettlement have to wait patiently in those acutely dangerous situations, I think is a grand deception. It's a grand deception on the individuals affected, and it's a grand deception, I believe, and would suggest, on the hospitality that is intrinsic to host communities such as Australia and New Zealand. And that, to me, I think is the challenge of the debate this evening, is how do we change the political and public narrative so that those arriving, however means, by a regular resettlement program or spontaneously at the borders by air or by sea, are accommodated and received with an appropriate level of dignity? And how do we demonstrate that to the public, who are rightly questioning the procedures and the policies and in some case the disorder that surrounds the current narrative here in Australia? It's our sense, and I'll leave it here in the interests of time and open discussion, that there is currently very little debate space for us to recreate a narrative. In the political dynamic, there is no space, I think, to have a sensible discussion about the humanitarian nature of asylum as it is today. I would suggest that in the media there is a very tiny, narrow space for an appropriate narrative on balancing these different relationships between resettlement as a humanitarian gesture and asylum as a protection right and a humanitarian gesture. That, I think, is where the debate needs to be framed, and I think that should be the common challenge. And how do you get that sort of discourse generated in a society that, notwithstanding the challenges and problems surrounding this issue publicly in this country, still believes genuinely in a fair go and the spirit of compassion. Thank you very much.
Next speaker for this evening is Professor Andrew Markus, and Andrew holds the Pratt Foundation Research Chair of Jewish Civilisation at Monash University and is a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. He's published extensively on Australian immigration and race relations. His recent publications include the co-authored Australia's Immigration Revolution 2009. He heads the Scanlon Foundation's Mapping Social Cohesion National Research Program, which conducted its 5th national survey in June-July 2012, and is the principal researcher on the Australian Jewish population and Yiddish Melbourne research project. So welcome, Andrew, and Andrew has some graphs for us.
If you want more information, because I'm just going to give you like a few key points, we have a website, Mapping Australia's Population, and I've also written on this subject. For example, in the conversation, there's a brief sort of overview of opinion. All right, let me just sort of give you, in a nutshell, what I think the issue is. There's a huge gulf between should and can. And in this space, I think people often don't understand the difference between should and can. It's like actually going to battle without intelligence. Because intelligence in the sense of knowing what's at stake, knowing the parameters, is a situation where people will interpret survey data in a way that is very naive. Because there's a sense that, I can look at the data, I can look at different surveys without being a professional in the field to make sense of it. So I've been to fora, for example, where lawyers have got up and explained public opinion. Now, I would never get up and want to explain international law to you, even though I can read the textbooks and so on, because I don't have the capacity. So my first point is that people often make the mistake of reading survey data very naively. Everyone's an expert. Just look at the numbers. Public opinion is fickle. Just how you word the question and so on. So that is a dismissal of the reality of the solidity of public opinion. So we can look at a number of questions. This is like just one question asked in 5 different surveys. To what extent do you have a sense of belonging in Australia? To a great extent. You see the numbers, 75, 72, 72, 73, 74. Rather than fickleness of public opinion, there's actually a great solidity and consistency in public opinion. For example, should Australia accept immigrants from very different countries? 67, 63, 62, 64, 65. You see that within 3% plus or minus, that you're getting very solid, consistent results. So the challenge is to try to work out, on which issues does opinion change, and on which issues is opinion pretty much fixed, embedded in concrete. And the challenge is not to just look at one survey, not to just look at one question, but look at a broad pattern. And that's what I'm just going to very briefly illustrate to you. So we look at surveying from 2000 to 2010. And you see, I've highlighted there the sort of people who are compassionate and supportive of asylum issues. And I haven't got time to look through it, to all of these questions, but I just want to illustrate to you that you can have 20 surveys and get the same results. So, in general, which of the following statements best describes your view on how Australia should deal with asylum seekers? Detained him in Camp 71, allowed them to live in the community until their application started 21. This is in the context of the Tampa issue and the rule of the federal court. And should the government support the federal court decision? 21% said yes. This is a whole series of surveys about turning back boats. And the people who disagree that boats should be turned back, you can see 2018, 22. And these are surveys conducted between 2001 and 2010, and you see the consistency. Now, if we look at 2011 and 2012, the most recent surveys, these are we've asked this question now 3 times, 2010, 2011 and 2012. Which of the following 4 statements comes closest to your view about the best policy for dealing with asylum seekers? And one option is turn back the boats. At the other end, they should be allowed permanent residence. You see the number for permanent residence? 23%. So it's always in that range, between roughly 20 to 25, give or take 1 or 2 points. And it doesn't really move very much from there, and that's a fundamental reality about life in Australia. This is the UNHCR survey that was done earlier this year, and again got the same results, you see. Are you more compassionate or less compassionate towards people who come by air and claim asylum, or people who come by boat? And the people who say more compassionate is 26%. Do you support or oppose the decision to resume offshore processing of asylum seekers? And oppose, and this was just in August, 27% opposed. Do you support or disapprove reopening detention facilities in Nauru and Manus Island? 18% opposed. Different techniques, different survey companies, very similar results. See the figure 67, both of them got 67% in support. So this is what I mean about intelligence and understanding the context. So what are my key points? First of all, we have to understand that we're not dealing essentially with misinformation, we're dealing with values. And when you're dealing with values, you don't change. You don't change. So what I've got here is I correlated the people who said that those who come by boats should be eligible for permanent residence, and then those who say turn back the boats. And then see what their views are on a range of issues. Immigration is too high, 16% as opposed to 69%. I disagree with the diverse immigration intake, 7%, 50%. I've got a negative view of Muslims, 9%, 43%. So what I'm saying is that it's correlated. Your view on boats, it's not essentially an issue of factual information. It's an issue essentially of your values and your orientation to life. This is my last slide. Is the problem ignorance? Is the problem media? Is it the way that the politicians are driving the debate? Contrary to that view, it's about values and it's about context and it's about the Australian national character. One of the essential characteristics of Australia over the last 100 years is that Australians have been obsessed with border control more than any other country. And because of their isolation, they've been able to enforce that obsession in a way that you can't enforce it in Pakistan, you can't enforce it in the EU, but you can in Australia. So you need to, I say, understand the national character, understand the distribution of attitudes. And so what you end up with is attitudes to boat people, regular maritime arrivals. The positive will be in the range of 19 to 27. On the other hand, support for the humanitarian program can reach 75% and has in our last survey. And to me, this is the terrain in which we must work. And in my sense, people generally don't understand the terrain. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I think he's trying to turn off the slides. While Andrew's doing that, I'm going to introduce our next speaker. So our next speaker is probably going to be very well known to everyone, I suspect. Imogen Bailey is an actress who's outspoken on issues of social justice and human rights. Her devotion to animals was recognised by the People of Ethical Treatment for Animals when she became the sole recipient of the International Humanitarian Award for Asia Pacific. She's been recognised also by the who's who of Australian women. On the question of refugees and asylum seekers, Imogen's notable for her participation in the second series of that wonderful SBS program, Go Back to Where You Came From. She's now an Asylum Seekers Resource Centre Ambassador, and she's launching a new initiative, the World's Biggest Classroom, which I'm sure she'll talk about tonight, and which you can join at www.lessonsoverboard.com. Thank you very much, Imogen.
Thank you, everyone, for having me. You have to bear with me. Part of being a part of this cause is about learning for me. So I have notes that are all over the place in coloured pen. It's like going back to school. And I had a speech prepared, but since listening to Richard and Andrew speak, there are some things that have spoken to me that I want to now address. Andrew, when you say values, makes perfect sense to me. I will go back and talk about go back, but I just want to talk about this first, is that basically when I came back from Go Back and I was very moved by that, I said to everybody around me, I want to do something about this. And I had to ask myself, well, what is the something and what is the this? and that's the thing, is when you become passionate about a cause, whether it's animal rights or human rights, I want to do something about this, and you have to kind of dissect that and work out what the something is and what the this is. And I think the this, tonight, you've really nailed it for me, Andrew, and I hope he has for many people in the room. When you say values, is the fact that where the debate is at now is actually, in an interesting, obscure way, a wonderful reflection of who we are as Australians, because it reflects that we are, in a sense, we are actually good people who are law-abiding, and that's what then links into what Richard was talking about with a fair go, is that we think, unfortunately, and this is the obscure part, is that we think, and the part that is wrong, we think that asylum seekers and refugees, at the moment, we equate that to being punished, that you're doing something wrong. And I'm not talking about people in this room who are obviously very interested in the subject, but overall, when I talk to people about this subject, that's what they say to me, is that they're queue jumpers, they're coming illegally. And so that is a reflection of our values, is that we go, well, as Australians, we're law-abiding, good people, we want to help, but we only want to help you if you do the right thing. So I come back to, I want to do something about this. And for me, that is education. And there's a great quote from Jesse Jackson, actually, that I really, really like, which is, don't look down to anyone unless you're helping them up. And at the moment, it's very difficult when you're very passionate about this cause not to point the finger at either side politically and say, well, you're doing this wrong and you're doing that wrong, but then you just get caught up in the vicious cycle that we were all in. And that is that the debate is about negative, negative, negative. It's about deter, 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 deter. And it's also about separating us from the issue, whether it's moving the border, whether it's detaining somebody offshore. It's all about separating us from the issue. So as good, compassionate, law-abiding Australians, how do we stop that separation, bring the debate back home and relate it to our values? And I believe that the best way that we can support this cause is to actually support our politicians by not pointing the finger at them. We need to create an environment where our politicians can change their mind, that they're not afraid that we won't vote for them, because at the moment, make no mistake, it is the only political statement that I will make during this evening, is that, make no mistake, right now people's lives are being sacrificed for votes. There's no mistake about that. I've actually heard stories from friends that work with NGOs who've spoken to politicians in private, who've spoken about politicians who've had tears in their eyes, whose partners have spoken about this issue with tears in their eyes, because they know that they can't do the right thing because they will lose their power. So when I look at education on this subject, something very interesting for me is the mirror image that we kind of actually hold up to each other between asylum seekers and us. And that is that when you talk to asylum seekers, the thing that they want is safety and education. They're the two things that are a big priority for them. And in order for us to give asylum seekers the safety that they need, we need to focus on education. And that means that we need to, in a sense, as much as I'm extremely passionate about this, and it's difficult for me to say, we kind of need to let our politicians off the hook and do our own work in the community to support them to make the change. And when I say that, I mean we need to be able to have a conversation about the turning points and the timeline of our political history without pointing the finger at either side or ostracising anybody that votes either way. Because there have absolutely been some very important, pivotal political turning points. We look at Tampa and how close Tampa was to 9/11. When we look at children overboard, those moments in time, those political moments in time, are what have shaped the debate now. So part of, as an advocate and part of anybody in this room who's interested in moving forward from a humanitarian perspective, is to create educational programs that talk to people about politics, how we got here, but we do it in a way that isn't pointing the finger. And there's something that the Prime Minister said recently about education. She said, education is good aid. And I really believe when it comes to this issue that education is the best aid that we can offer. We really need to appeal to Australians' core values. We need to get across the message that it is not illegal to seek asylum, that there is no queue, and that we can't detain people offshore. We can't separate ourselves from this issue. And in order to bring it home, to really bring it home, we need to start to talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We need to start talking about the Refugee Convention. And we need to start explaining that national responsibility and international solidarity are mutually reinforcing concepts. So what we do with this issue actually contributes to world peace, and it contributes to the problem overall. It's not just about the numbers that we take, it's how we treat these people, and that is how we start to act as global citizens. So I know I've kind of jumped all over the place, and like I said, I'm in learning. I have notes done in colour. I actually have pretty bad ADD. But I just want to go back on that I really currently feel that the biggest problem that we have is that when you hear asylum seeker, we equate it to being punished. That's what asylum means in Australia at the moment, is that if you're seeking asylum, you're doing something wrong. And the word asylum is actually a beautiful, important word that we need to have in our language, and we need to get across to people that it's about people's rights. It's about people's rights for safety, for freedom, and to be taken care of. And for Australia to move forward as humanitarian leaders, what we need to do is to start educating people and bring the issue back home, relate to the issue. Just a couple of other really quick things when it comes to go back. Just because I know people want to hear about go back, is that during my experience with go back, that really was the thing for me, is that I was so saddened by what was going on in Africa, in Somalia, in Indonesia. This is a global problem, and we're currently stuck in this vicious cycle that is just about Australia. And we need to be global citizens, and we need to move forward so that we can help with this issue overall. So, but just again, education is good aid, and if you want to support this cause, please don't get stuck in the chaos of the politics. Get stuck in the chaos of the human lives that need to be helped, because that's really what this is about. Asylum is about seeking safety and protection, and every single human being has a right to it, even every single Australian, if they so ever needed. So please remember that, bring it home.
Thanks very much, Imogen. Our next speaker is Ahmed Dini. And Ahmed, are you happy speaking from... You're going to go to... Okay, so Ahmed was born in Somalia and raised in a Kenyan refugee camp. He was 2 years old when his family fled the war, and in 1996, at the age of 8, was accepted into Australia as part of our refugee program. He was educated at Debney Park Secondary College in Flemington and is now an advocate for young people within his community. Ahmed also sits on the board of Flemington Neighbourhood Renewal, and in 2006 was announced as Moonee Valley's Youth Citizen of the Year for his contribution to young people. In 2007, he was nominated as Young Muslim of the Year. A year later was awarded the Victoria Police Community Participation Award. In 2011, announced as a People for Australia Ambassador and inducted into the Victorian Refugee Recognition Record. Most recently, he was announced as Victorian Local Hero of the Year and was awarded the prestigious Sachs Award for Leadership in the not-for-profit sector. So thank you, Ahmed.
Thank you, Penny. Please excuse me. I think I've taken everyone's award, but it shows the work that I'm doing, and obviously the work that a refugee can do in this country, and the contribution a refugee can make in this great land. My journey does start in Mogadishu, and it's a place where Imogen went. I come from one of the most dangerous cities in the world. I was born in Mogadishu. I fled with my parents, especially with my mother. At that time, there was 3 of us, me being the youngest, and she crossed into the Kenyan border. She walked 90 kilometers with me on her back, and my little brother, my older brother was just 1 year older than me at that time, who would have been 3, probably screaming for help as well, and my older sister. But nonetheless, we arrived in Kenya. We stayed in Kenya for a period of time before my father turned up 2 years later, because he was caught up and he was unsafe in Mogadishu and he had to hide from militias. But nonetheless, he arrived in Kenya, and as a family we came together. We lived in Kenya for a good 6 years in a refugee camp before being accepted into Australia. The feeling, honestly, I had when I came to this country was that of difference to the one that I lived, because every day you wake up in a refugee camp, you're in a survival mode. Even your parents tell you don't venture out. Just stay within the borders, don't go far, because you never know. Militia group could come out of nowhere, abduct you, and you become a child soldier. But thankfully, my parents were always around me to make sure that I wouldn't. Coming to Australia, I knew I was presented with opportunities. Opportunities that are presented to not many of the young people that I left behind who were my friends in those refugee camps. I still talk to, it was just recently, I was celebrating the Muslim Eid for the Hajj, and a friend of mine, I don't know how he got in contact with me, he found me on Facebook. I left him in a refugee camp in 1996. He found my contacts and just about 3 weeks ago, and he told me, "You got to send me money, mate." So for me, I'm lucky. I say I'm lucky because I got both my parents here. I've got a sense of belonging in this country because I have contributed to this country. I do believe I'm Australian. Sometimes I actually get irritated when people call me a refugee, because I'm like, how long do I have to be a refugee to be accepted into this country? But nonetheless, I also like the idea of being a refugee, because if you don't know your past, you'll never know your future, or where you belong in society. I know I'm a refugee, and this country has welcomed so many people from different countries of the world. I know that the debate that's going now about refugees, it doesn't sit well with me, and it doesn't sit well with a lot of the young people that I grew up with in the Flemington Flats, because we're all refugees, either coming from Turkey, Afghanistan, myself from Somalia, other friends who have come from the continent in Africa, from different countries. But for me, I know that the Australian public are people who do give you a fair go, because wherever I've been in my life, I've been given a fair go. And I do know that, yes, we are living in a world today which is more dangerous than ever. After certain wars, the world does seem to be a more dangerous place. After the financial crisis, the world does seem to be a poorer place. And a lot of people see these as a way of just holding on to what they've got and not giving it up. But Australia is a big country. It's big enough for all of us, and I know that Australia can play a role in international, in the sense of global, to make sure that the issue of refugees and asylum seekers plays a prominent role in how we can distinguish the difference between terrorists, criminals, and the common person who's been living in a refugee camp for years, who wants to come to this country and make a better life, just like I have, just like many of my fellow men have. Australia recently has been appointed into the UN Security Council, I do believe, and that brings a huge responsibility. I think a shift of the tone has to take place. We are leaders in the community now. We're leaders in the global community, and we need to be seen as a country that welcomes refugees, that wants to talk about the issues of refugees, rather than a country who just wants to stop everyone at their border. Luckily, I was never stopped at the border because I came with Qantas. But going back to the work that I'm doing, and what I want to honestly see is a country that has not only people of different ethnicities, of different backgrounds, but country of people who have different faiths that embrace one another. Because recently I actually took a group of refugee young people to Spain to play a football tournament. And all these young people are under the age of 18. And we represented Australia as a country, wearing Australian colours, the green and gold, carrying the Australian flag. And these kids that I took over there, none of them ever left this country since they came to this country. They all come from single parent households, mothers, who are struggling to just make sure that all these kids are either going to school or trying to participate positively in society. One of the kids came up to me, he goes, "I've never loved Australia more than any other country in the world." I said to him, "Why?" Because he goes, "I've never seen so much people begging in my life." And this is Spain in Europe, a country who stood for thousands of years in any case. So for him to have that sense of feeling that he's Australian, he loves this country because of the opportunities, and for him to see that there's people in Europe who are struggling, showed him that he appreciated this country. I also do, and I honestly do encourage that a greater dialogue needs to take place, and we should encourage people to base their views on factual outcomes, like Andrew said, rather than just things that mostly people will make up and everybody thinking they're expert on their fields. I think we're in a position to educate and to create a kind of environment. I have been given the opportunity for a kind environment, and I've taken it. And because of the work that I've done, I have been recognized in this country as someone who's making changes, someone who's helping people of the former refugees, but also mainstream society. And I just want to see Australia where we can all see that helping people can create stories and not only make our country stronger, but actually the best place to be in the world. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ahmed. So our final speaker, but certainly not the least, is Debbie Whitmont, who's a reporter on Four Corners on ABC. She was also a lawyer. She studied law and worked as a legal aid lawyer before becoming a journalist. And she's worked in news and current affairs for more than 20 years and was the ABC's Middle East correspondent during the 1990s. She is also a multi-award winner. We've got a lot of them on this panel today. She's got 2 Walkley Awards to her name and 3 Human Rights Commission Awards for her programs, including programs on asylum seekers. So we'll hear from Debbie next. Thank you.
Thanks, Penny. But I changed them all for an award that was Local Hero. That's a beautiful award. It's nice, after what Andrew said, to be a journalist and not be seen as part of the problem, or indeed all of the problem. And I found it really interesting what Andrew said too, because what we're looking at is how do we change the public narrative. That's going to be very difficult when essentially those values seem to be fixed. And what I wanted to talk about today is actually something that happened to me more than 10 years ago, but it seems to be completely unchanged, I think, and is an interesting case study, and was to me, I still don't really know what to make of it all, about how public opinion and media and this issue all interrelate. And I actually can't believe that I'm still thinking about this, because it happened in 2001 and I thought by now we would have moved on so far that it would be completely irrelevant. So the first time I did a story about asylum seekers for Four Corners, it was in 2001. It was before the Tampa had come, the Twin Towers were still up there and the Howard government was in, and I didn't know anything about asylum seekers. And then I found out about people in Villawood, in particular this Iraqi doctor. And having been in the Middle East, I thought, what's an Iraqi doctor doing in Villawood Detention Centre? You know, they can practice here, blah, blah. You know, if you're an Iraqi, you've got good reason to flee. Anyway, that was a long story. But it ended up, we did a Four Corners program, myself and a producer called Peter McAvoy. And we used footage from a camera that was smuggled into Villawood Detention Centre. Some of you might have seen it. And it showed a young boy called Cheyenne Badrai, who was only 6 at the time, and he'd stopped eating, drinking and even speaking as a result of the traumatic experiences he'd had in Villawood and in Woomera before that. And the other thing we did was we talked to some escapees who described what was going on inside Villawood. Anyway, that program went to air on the 13th of August 2001. When it went to air, the ABC's internet, which was the sort of sole feedback mechanism at the time, went into complete meltdown. We had the biggest online response that had ever been at that point. I think it was succeeded later by the animal cruelty story. Anyway, we had several thousand supportive messages that night, and we counted less than 5 that were negative. But that was at first. Then what was really odd was that the Canberra Press Gallery, I'm sorry to say this in Canberra, was strangely silent. So was the Labor Party. Not one journalist, other than the ABC's 7:30 report, contacted us to follow up the story. We thought that was pretty odd. Then a few days later, some started to attack us. Some of the usual suspects, I might say. Piers Ackerman was first. Exploiting a troubled 6-year-old boy for political purposes is a despicable act, he wrote in the Daily Telegraph. Paul Sheehan followed up, a parody of investigative journalism. And then, disappointingly, one of my favourite columnists at that time, the Sydney Morning Herald's leading columnist, Alan Ramsey, who said detention centres are not meant to be holiday camps, blah, 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 blah. And I think that's interesting when you talk about values, because maybe that's what's happening there. Anyway, not one of those journalists contacted us to ask us anything about the story. And when Ramsey made several errors in his piece, which indicated he hadn't even seen the story, we wrote to the Sydney Morning Herald, which was his paper, with a letter to draw his attention to these errors. And the Herald wouldn't publish the letter. Then about a week after the program, sorry, I sound like I'm whinging here, but this is what happened. I was quite shocked by this. About a week after the program, the Four Corners office had been getting quite positive phone calls. We get a lot of phone calls at Four Corners. Suddenly the tenor of those calls completely changed, and it turned out that they were people who would ring up, and I guess this isn't the smartest thing to say, but they would say things like, I never saw that program, but I heard about it on Talkback Radio and I think it's really terrible. Can you believe people speak like that? But they did. Anyway, so that was sort of quite shocking. A year later, Mungo McCallum wrote a quarterly essay looking at asylum seekers that some of you may have read. It was called Girt by Sea. And he noted this response to the program and found it quite surprising, because it was indeed a shocking case of child abuse, I think, what had happened to Cheyenne in the detention system, and you might know later there was a payout and he was deeply traumatised. Mungo McCallum said he thought that the program in fact had the opposite result to what I had hoped it would have. He said if the decision to use the boat people as election fodder had not already been taken by the time of Cheyenne's case, it was certainly taken then. In other words, I think what he's saying is that the government, the politicians, saw it, saw what the lack of response, I think, publicly, or the largely negative response, and then realised that perhaps they could use this as a political issue. I assume that's what he means. Anyway, it was exactly, of course, the opposite to what we would have wanted to happen. But I think, and I'll just be brief, one thing that the program did do, and I think this is still an issue, and I'm tearing my hair out trying to work out what we can do now. The program humanised asylum seekers. It put a face on it, and that face was the face of a little boy. In fact, in the program, Amar Sultan, the doctor who very bravely filmed inside Villawood, spoke to the camera, and he said, he understood it better than I did, I think, then. He said, I realise why we are behind these walls. These walls are not to keep us in, but to keep you Australians out. And I think that's what's happening now too, out of sight, out of mind. I find it quite distressing that I read on my Twitter account and on Facebook events that are happening in Nauru. I read about the hunger strike. I'm sitting there in my bedroom. I'm reading that there's a hunger strike in Nauru. I don't know what I can do to have any impact on that or what I can do for those people. But I also, as a journalist, I can't get there. So it's still a very live issue. And I think compounded with that, we've got a difficult political situation. We've also got a bit of asylum seeker fatigue among the public. And it's very hard as a journalist to know how to cover this issue now. Apart from detention centres still being closed, apart from the values, as we can see, that are the majority of, I suppose, the population are not positive about this issue. But I do think and perhaps Andrew would talk about this more, what the Cheyenne example showed is that one of our values is compassion. I mean, there are competing values here. And when we saw a little boy who was so badly harmed and so many people think of their own children, people were moved by that. But then perhaps the other values come into play. Anyway, there's little space in the media for a proper debate, and I would really welcome anyone who can suggest how we can, as journalists, and particularly a program like Four Corners, help change this public narrative and contribute constructively to this debate. But I don't know how. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you to all our speakers for those presentations. I'm now going to ask a few questions to get a conversation going amongst the panellists, and then we'll open out to the audience. So Andrew framed this issue as one of values, and I think Debbie at the end was saying, well, perhaps there's a clash of values. And so one question I wanted to ask is, well, what about the values that are embodied in the Refugee Convention? And Rick might want to start perhaps with an answer to that. What are the values embodied in the Refugee Convention, and why aren't we hearing more about that? Is it that Australians just don't care about that set of values?
Well, I don't think it's for a Kiwi to comment on Australian values, but I'm a bit safer ground when I talk about the values that underpin the Refugee Convention. The 1951 Convention is probably the most important practical instrument for protecting victims of human rights violations that has ever been. It's an entirely functional, practical instrument that has probably not only helped individuals, and millions of them around the world since it was first conceived in 1951, but it's also helped governments and states grapple with the enormous complexities of people moving across international borders. The institution of asylum and the Refugee Convention actually gives states a predictable mechanism for deciding who can stay and who can't, which in the world of mixed migration and complex motivations across and within borders is an enormously important instrument. And yet that instrument of protection, but is also an instrument of state pragmatism, has been sidelined in this country. And that's what gives us probably the deepest concern, that the narrative and the politics of deterrence based solely on the manner of arrival in this country has actually taken away from the public debate, but also from governments and successive governments, a very important instrument of managing difficult cases that are crossing over borders. And that, I think, is the challenge that we've got, is how to persuade and encourage those who are responsible for these conventions being implemented, that they are not only just moral and ethical statements of importance, but they are also highly practical and pragmatic to help solve difficult, challenging issues.
There are other panellists who want to comment on that. I mean, Andrew, do you ask questions about values embodied in human rights instruments as part of the survey, and what sort of information do you get back?
Look, you ask a set of general questions because you don't do surveys to get narrow specifics. You want to understand the lie of the land, and that's what I was trying to do, indicate the lie of the land, and then you can make predictions. I think the most useful way forward is if people actually try to think of scenarios for the next year and next 2 years and the likely scenarios and what interventions you can actually usefully make. To me, that is very important. And I must say, I actually don't see people realistically grappling with scenarios.
Other comments on that?
I would just say that there is absolutely a need to make that connection between the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Refugee Convention, because the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is to protect everybody, and we need to educate people more about both of them and bring it home and create an affiliation with Australians and our values, is that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights actually affects us. And if it's not being upheld for the most vulnerable people, how can we be sure that it's going to be upheld in our future for us as Australians? And I think that from an education perspective, both of those things, when you talk to people about these issues, most people have become so lethargic about the asylum seeker issue that they're not even interested in what the words are in either of those documents. And I think, as Rick said, they're extremely important instruments, and therefore it should be an absolute priority that Australia talks about, and all humanitarians work to educate people on the wording and how that affects us.
What about the role of politicians? Imogen, I thought perhaps let them off a bit lightly.
No, I wasn't letting them off lightly. I just mean that they clearly can't do it. They clearly cannot do it. So we have to make a move to educate ourselves as a community and create a space where we say to them, okay, now we get it, now you catch up.
Do other panellists agree with that? Are we giving up on expecting politicians to lead?
They're actually leading. They're just going in the wrong direction.
I wanted to ask too about, so Andrew, you showed us the stats on what people thought. How well does that translate, that concern about boat arrivals actually translate into votes? And is that something that's come out from your survey?
It's a where you can be effective is where you can capture the middle ground and swing it one way or the other, rather than the true believers. And the Labor Party is in the situation where the data that I showed and other data tells them that this is a no-win issue. It's a no-win issue for them. So unless they sort of, race Liberals to, a point where we don't want to see them going, unless they do that, it translates into significant votes. And in the context of the parties coming closer together, in terms of the polling that we're now seeing, it becomes more significant for Labor to be in that space where we don't want to really see them.
So then is it really up to the public, and what do concerned members of the public do if they're worried about this debate and the tone of it?
Well, can I just ask Andrew, you said scenarios, and I don't really know what you mean by that.
Yeah.
Do you mean, for example, Nauru is going to fill up with people, boats will still come, there'll be a terrible sort of crisis there? Is that the sort of
That's what I think would be useful for people to sit down and think through.
Yeah. So
Because there's a commitment, there's 100% commitment that they're not going back in the short term.
Does that then mean, I think that is interesting, because that does seem to be a possible scenario, loosely, one way or
People
another.
losing their lives.
Yeah, and so what will that then do to our values and our debate, and will the public shift? And will it then be that perhaps we look at the rule of law and go, well, we do need an ordered way of doing this. But I would also say I think people, they hear about the convention and I hate to say this, but I'm not sure there's that much faith in it, because a lot of people, a general view would be, well, once the people are here, they might be found not to be refugees, but it's very hard to send them back anyway. And then they appeal and they clog up the courts and they're here forever. So, in a way, just learning, holding up the words of the convention don't satisfy a lot of people, unfortunately, because they look at the reality and they have their own view about what that is.
I agree, and I think that standard, unfortunately, is set by the fact that we have politicians who are prepared to make defamatory and false statements, and so they're not being held accountable, and also not held accountable to those documents, and that's why people kind of go, well, but at the end of the day, if we don't start educating the community about those documents and also making the connection that those documents are in place as part of a global movement towards world peace, towards protecting people worldwide, and that at the moment we're stuck in this position where we have people saying, tow back the boats, that this is how we're saving lives. No. If we don't stick to those or adhere to those documents and educate ourselves about it, we are in fact responsible for even more lives. Because if other countries duplicate what we're doing, how many more lives will be lost? And so I guess that's my point is that we have to go deeper with the education of what Australia does and how that is affected in a global context, not only as a reflection to us, but what it means for things like world peace, not just, I think Australia is sick of, hearing about, and it's horrible, but sick of hearing about just, what is Australia doing in that little part. So can we relieve some of that by talking about the bigger picture? Because we're clearly all very interested in things like China and what that can do for our economy. So, how do we bring it into that big sphere?
So perhaps one last question for the panel before I open it up to the audience. What about the role of the media here? So Debbie said she was very pleased she wasn't being attacked, but perhaps Ahmed, you might like to comment on the role of the media and how you think refugees or people from a refugee background are portrayed?
Well, yeah, it's a double-edged sword, honestly. I think usually you would mostly, especially asylum seekers, you get all the negative. Like when you watch the media, and you got to look at the media. There's different media here. Like mainstream media, you look at the Channel 7, 8, Channel 9 and 10 and stuff like that. There is this sense that you're not welcome. There's this idea that people coming here are they're doing something wrong, like they're stealing something from us. We got to keep them at bay. We got to make sure that they're away from our shore and stuff like that. But you look at more like multicultural media and SBS and stuff, and you see this leniency towards accepting and trying to understand the issue. And also, I think the issue here is in the fact that it's being politicized. I think the media is playing off our leaders. Our leaders are politicizing the issue, and they're politicizing people on a boat coming to this country looking for a better life, and it's quite dangerous. But then the thing is, the media's job is to make sure that they feed off the leaders and what they're saying, and they tell it to the wider public, and that's why you have a lot of the majority of Australians probably not understanding the issue and where this whole idea is coming from and why these people actually want to come to this country.
Rick, you've probably had a bit of experience with the media too.
Come across them once or twice. It seems like, in a personal view, it seems to me that the predominant media and political narrative in Australia at the moment is shaped by the politics of deterrence, and everybody's in that space. It's all about deterrence, which in my opening remarks I was trying to say attacks at the root of the institution of asylum and the Refugee Convention, because the two go hand in hand. And it attacks at its root the idea that you can show up unwelcome and uninvited at somebody's territory and ask for help. That whole narrative criminalises people who try to do that sort of thing. And it creates a tolerance, I believe, in society for the politics of deterrence. And what I find striking at this particular moment is that the level of political agitation and media coverage on the refugee asylum issue in Australia has actually dipped down because there has been a narrowing of the gap in the political space. There's been a convergence, I suggest, between the political parties on this issue. And yet the protection issues that we are seeing emerging in this country in Nauru have probably never been as serious as they are today. There are more than 7,000 people who've come to this country post 13 August, which was the cut-off date of the new initiatives, who haven't had anybody look at their refugee claims or undertake any form of real assessment as to their vulnerability. So men, women and children and families are in indefinite mandatory detention in Australia and have no idea at all as to when that process is going to be unfrozen and unlocked. We've seen what is happening in Nauru at the moment, and we don't need to be reminded that if you keep people in remote places for too long, you remove any hope or understanding about where they fit and how their reality is going to be. You do see high levels of community violence and acts of violence against others and against individuals. So for us, the protection issues that are arising out of this current set of politics of deterrence are very, very serious, and it's quite stunning and I think saddening that it isn't igniting the sort of instinctive reaction that should be in a society to say, well, hang on, this is not working. The other element to this, and again plays into the narrative about who's a genuine refugee or not, about 90% of the people who come to Australia by boat, whose claims are assessed in Australia, are found under the tightest and narrowest refugee definition to be genuine, legitimate refugees who need protection. I mean, unlike mixed migration flows in other parts of the world, we are talking about almost exclusively a genuine refugee population who need help and are entitled to it under international law. And yet somehow they've been criminalised in the narrative of deterrence as economic migrants, worthy of being sent back without anybody even looking at their claims, and justifying in some way, underpinning some very extreme and tough policies that are not just about deterring the next load, but in fact end up punishing those who are already here. So it is a deeply worrying set of issues at the moment because there isn't that vital and healthy counter-argument in the current debate.
Can I just say, on that point, that's actually part of the problem. If 90% of the people who come are found to be genuine, that's part of the problem as far as governments are concerned, and it's part of the problems in terms of trying to sell a humane policy.
So are we saying we're getting it wrong there, Andrew, or?
No, like if the government could show that 20% of the people were found to be genuine, there's a sifting process going on, and they will be admitted into the society, but 80% are found not to be genuine and sadly have to be returned, then you've actually got a policy. Where you've got a situation where practically 100% of people, which is where we've been in the last 5 years, close to, but not 100%, you don't have a policy.
But is that true? I mean, given the context that we've got such small numbers coming via
See, I don't even agree
unauthorised
that
channels,
we've got small numbers.
comparatively.
Well, what do you see? That's again a problem because a lot of the, because I've had to sort of try to understand where people are coming from public opinion, and I don't believe they're coming from a bigoted position. So a lot of the advocacy comparisons are false. Like Australia is compared to Europe, Australia is compared to the United States. Australia's a small country, relatively, by whatever criteria you care to actually bring into this space. It's not small. And I think that the general public don't see it as small.
So then,
The advocates see it as small, the general public doesn't.
is the issue then, what is the scenario we need to present? Because the scenario is rip up the convention, just send people back no matter what they're facing. If we actually put that to people, would they think about the other values that are embodied in the Refugee Convention? Because that's the unpalatable alternative here, isn't it?
My last point. See, in terms of scenario, that's the really bad scenario. That you actually end up in a situation where lawyers go to the High Court and the Federal Court and win decisions, and there's a Liberal government, and the Liberal government withdraws from the UN Convention with public acclaim. That's the really bad position we don't want to end up.
Can I just put a slightly different view on that? If it's widely understood and recognised that 90% of the people coming by boat to Australia are actually genuine people at risk of being harmed if they're sent back, then that consensus will open up a different kind of discussion. In other words, if it can't be that they get protection here, then where will that be? And in our argument, that opens up a serious discussion with Southeast Asia. Because what you need to do is, if you cannot or are unwilling to provide an effective level of responsible protection in this place, people will still be refugees. It's just that you're shoving the burden onto somebody else, to another state, to another population, to shoulder the burden. Now, the idea of burden sharing is not just a slogan or a catchword. It is a fundamentally important part of the international solidarity of refugee protection. Countries that live far from the places of displacement can share the burden by keeping their borders open for the relatively small number who come this far, by having well-managed refugee resettlement programs, by supporting the institution of asylum. If every country around the world that had signed the Refugee Convention decided to excise the entirety of their territories tomorrow, the international solidarity of Refugee Convention and refugee protection would crumble overnight, and we would have chaos. Chaos for governments, chaos for states, and tragedy for individuals. So the precedent that is being set by Australia in this part of the world is very keenly watched by countries that are far closer to the point of reference and the reality of human displacement today. And that to us is a very good reason why global citizenship and leadership is extremely important on behalf of Australia and like-minded states.
Okay, I think at this point we will open up to the audience because it looks like there are a lot of hands, and I'm going to choose one from each side as we go. So I've got one questioner here and one here.
I'm just interested.
Can you just wait for the mic to...
Andrew, I was just interested in your comment about if you had a 20% success rate, then you would have a policy, and the implications that has on the application of the rule of law in this country. And it just seemed interesting to me that you would equate refugee decision-making processes with a policy when we've been trying very hard to have that respected as a legal process, as M61 went some way to establishing. What's your take on that?
My take on that is that lawyers work in a very important space and public decisions are made in a different space. And I was illustrating for you the realities of the decision making in that other space. I don't agree with it. I'm not saying I agree with it, but I'm saying think about it.
Oh, hi. My name is Claire and I'm from the Refugee Action Committee in Canberra, which has been going for nearly as long as you've been working on that issue, and I sympathise with your fatigue. I have so many questions, I hardly know where to begin, but I just want to say, first of all, it seems to me I can see a real contradiction here between Imogen and Andrew. Sorry, is it not working?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Is that better? Yeah. Sorry, I can see a real contradiction between Imogen and Andrew, because Andrew's saying values won't change. Imogen says we've got to educate people, but he says facts aren't going to change things. So this is what I feel we're up against. But my two questions, if I'm allowed to, is first to Richard. You mentioned that people accept generally resettlement people coming as refugees, accepted as refugees, as opposed to boat people, but you don't mention asylum seekers who arrive by air, who are treated in a different way altogether and seem not to be demonised in the way boat people are. My question for anyone is, the response I've had from politicians about the Houston report when I criticise it is, but we're doing this to stop people drowning. How do you respond to that?
I'm going to take the easy one. No, you're right. The issue of people coming by air and claiming asylum is the untold reality. Up until last year, there were more people coming by air claiming asylum than there were people by boat. I mean, in the last 12, 18 months, that has been obviously reversed. But what I find interesting in that is it doesn't excite any real public interest at all. People are quite happy to allow 5,000, 6,000 people to come into the territory, overstay visas, and for whatever reason mutate their right of entitlement to stay into a refugee claim, and that happens a great deal. And I would suggest that probably statistically, people coming in that way are less likely to be refugees than people who come by boat. So the contradiction in that statistic is not well understood here. There is clearly something about boats which exists in your long historical narrative. People are far more comfortable with resettlement because that fits with this, dare I say, a sort of quaintly Anglo-Saxon idea of a queue. I know people who've come from parts of the world who don't understand the nature of the queue at all. If you want something badly enough, then you go and take it. And the idea of a queue can be quite a quaint Anglo-Saxon concept in itself. It fits much more tightly with the idea of management and invitation for a far-flung state like Australia and like New Zealand. Unless you think that I'm being unduly critical of Australia, the same instinct exists in New Zealand, except we're 2,000 kilometres further away and haven't had boats. But I can assure you that the same kind of debate would develop over time, as you have here, if boats did start coming there.
Well, I wanted to answer your second question, but can you just repeat it to me?
Sure. When I went to talk to my local MP about the Houston report and my concerns about it, and his main argument was, yes, but the whole idea is to stop the people drowning. To stop people drowning. That was the reason he gave me.
Yeah, because it's something that I come up against, the exact same thing. And there was actually a comment that the UN High Commissioner made today. Is it Navi Pillay? Is that how I pronounce it? Her name? Oh, is that how I pronounce her name properly? And she was talking about Nauru, and she said it was in relation to people that are on hunger strike. And she quite simply said, if they were being treated well, then that wouldn't be happening. And I would say the same thing, is that if we had a better process in place and from spending time with families in Jakarta, the simple thing is communication. They just want to know yes, no, or when. And so when I talk to people about it, that's what I say, is that you cannot, the maths, it doesn't add up. You can't sacrifice human life, you can't save human lives by sacrificing human rights. And when the boats are clearly still coming, so that's the thing, that's the argument, is that if we had a process in place, if there actually was, what if there was a queue? If there was a queue, we know it doesn't exist, but if there was a better process in place, then people would stop getting on boats. And why are we not setting up processing there to, even if it is right on the shore. Why are we not doing that? It would cost less.
I think it's clear we're not trying to stop them drowning, we're trying to stop them arriving
Yes.
undrowned.
Yeah.
Precisely that's what worries me, is that this is their argument to the public, and the public say, oh yes, well, we can't have any more drownings, yes, we better implement this policy.
Okay, there are more questions from the floor. I think anyone on this side? Okay, we'll take two from this side then, perhaps one there and one up there.
Thanks. I'm Misha Coleman from the Australian Churches Refugee Network. I'd like to ask Andrew and anybody else who wants to comment about the degree to which this politics of deterrence and the descent of this debate, the degree to which it's gone so low is because of the Muslim nature of the refugee sort of, influx at the moment, as it's been called. So you mentioned you had some questions up there before, Andrew, about, sort of what your view is on Muslim sort of versus, I don't know what it was versus, but I've been out on the streets campaigning for the local government elections in the last 3 months, and the number of people who accosted me about asylum seekers and refugees, and because the view being that the Muslim refugee is less deserving or more problematic than the Anglo refugee. So could anybody who wants to comment on that?
Just a very quick remark. I don't buy into that at all. By far the largest number of people who've come to Australia by boat this year are Sri Lankans, either Sinhalese or Tamils. There is not even a hint of religiosity, if I can use the word in that. And the fact that the other populations coming are from Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Pakistan and stateless reflects the huge human insecurity in those places, which is not about the religion.
We know that, but that's not the public perception, and it's not the political sort of dimension that's being played out in media.
You don't want to sort of overly give too much credit to the public for its capacity to differentiate between different streams. Like, whenever you actually plunge into how much do people actually know, you're struck by the fact how little they do know. Like, if you ask people what percentage of people are coming by boats, less than 5% would get within the ballpark, okay? Less than 5%. Similarly, when we ask people about level of immigration, we've had in the last 5 years immigration go up, down by a huge margin, and as far as most people are concerned, it hasn't changed at all. So this actually gets back to the point you made that Imogen and I, we're actually in a different position in a way, because you're going to educate the public, and I say good luck. But at the end of the day, there's a very important point to be made, that you who are out there and trying to educate the public, that's a wonderful credit to you, yes? Because we wouldn't want to be in a situation where you're cynically saying you're not going to get anywhere. That's a wonderful credit to you, and it's part of the conversation, and it's part of the dialectic, and it's really important to maintain that.
But I guess what I would say back to you is that it's like the comment that you made before about the 20%, which I think was a little bit misunderstood. I come from a marketing background as well, so I know you just have to reframe it. You have to reframe it, and you have to focus on education that actually creates affiliation and connection. And what you're talking about with your stats absolutely reflects that. So what I would say to you is that the difficulty that I know, and I'm sure you would agree with this, the difficulty is that getting the stories out, getting faces and names, and getting people to just have the discussion from seeing stories is very difficult, because, and I'm going to be blatantly honest here, I have never had conversations with people in television and been asked, what is the what's the white Australian angle, until I got involved with this issue. And I've never been more saddened by the fact that I am so passionate about this cause, and I just want the best for not only these people but also for Australia, because I love this country and I want to see us lead as humanitarians, and you can't get the stories out there. So, and I know that that's not, what I'm giving you is not an answer, but I guess as a community, what we really need to work for, and I don't know how we do that either, is creating platforms where we can get these personal stories out and we can talk about things like asylum seekers, like religions and us working together and not have any political influence. And that's really the key is and the missing thing, and what my whole thing is education, because I do believe that all those people that you were talking to might have a different perspective if the only thing that they if they'd seen more than just say the recent riots and things, and that framed in how the commercial networks choose to frame that. And I say that hoping that they will still employ me, because I need to be employed to continue with this.
I do think, though, and this is why Nauru is a terrible thing, I think. When that happens is when people are actually in the community and when people actually meet somebody. Like you, I'm sure that's your experience, and people I've interviewed, when they actually know some asylum seekers, well, they're just my friend, blah, blah. So it is that familiarity thing. But at the moment, we're being prevented from being able to do that because these people are being kept away from us.
Have you got the microphone?
I have got the microphone. This is a question for Debbie and for anyone else that might want to comment. Just going on from that discussion there, reflecting on last year in television coverage of different rights abuses last year, and Debbie, you mentioned the Four Corners show about the cattle and the cruel treatment of the cattle, and Sarah Ferguson did that show for Four Corners. Some months later, she did a show on Four Corners about detention and asylum seekers in detention, and my understanding was that was one of the lowest rating shows for Four Corners. But in terms of getting voices out there, it was a real attempt to get people who are in detention, their voices and their faces out there, and as well as people who'd been out of detention, and we're talking of that experience of long-term detention. And it was heartening to see that, but the reaction was very different to the show about the cattle. And I think what was also really interesting was the response by politicians. They seemed to be falling, particularly the backbenchers in the Labor Party, were falling all over each other to try to stop what clearly was inhumane treatment of the cattle. But as we were talking about before, there is a great reluctance for many politicians to speak publicly and sympathetically, and I think most recently we're seeing once again activism within the Labor Party about animal rights but not human rights. Do you have any reflections on that and how we might change that, or in addition to animal rights, elevate human rights?
I have many reflections on that. There was actually a tragic cartoon that you might have seen that I can't remember who did it, which had the people in the asylum boat, and it's there in the water, and you can see Australia approaching, and they say, "Quick, let's put on the cow suits." Look, I think it's terrible. Let me say both those programs were really badly rating, and so influence and ratings are not the same thing. So the cow program was probably even less watched, mostly because people were scared to watch it, than the asylum seeker program. But I guess the difference is political impact. There was something very easy that the government could do to react. In fact, they'd done it before the thing had even gone to air. They were already doing it. Whereas this is a much more complicated issue. After our Villawood program, actually one of the really positive things that happened was that a woman called Diane Hiles got a group of people together and they became Chill Out. And they campaigned to get children out of detention, which then worked, and they folded, and now they've reopened Chill Out, sadly. But, I suppose the problem is, if you're doing, say, a story like that, not to say that you're looking for a political outcome, but it depends on whether there is one that's easy, I think. I don't know what you'd say, Rick, but cows seem more easily solved.
Can't expect me to answer that one.
Okay. Well, I guess Twitter moments, because it's that quick recognition, isn't it? Because I remember a time, like I come from working in animal rights, and I remember a time when you couldn't get any, you know, politicians did not want to touch it. So I guess there is some hope that they will come around on this subject. Hopefully it doesn't take 10 years, though.
Some Twitter moments, it seems to me, they're a bit unpredictable. Some of them do lead to something, and some of them, you know, erupt, and then 5 minutes
gone.
later, everyone else is onto
The
some
next
other thing.
Yeah.
So they're quite, you know.
Okay, I think we have a few more. There's one up there. Can we get a microphone to that person who's been patiently waiting? And then Savitri just...
Imogen, I want to say congratulations to you, and I think 100% what you're saying about education is so true. I don't have the same experience, Andrew, as perhaps what you're saying, because I've done a lot of public speaking in groups that are very, very anti-refugee work. One of the tricks I've found is when the guy comes, you know, we've got to follow the queue. I say, you know, sir, would you like to come up the front? And because I don't quite understand what you're saying, so would you like to come up the front and tell people about the queue? they can't, and it's a brilliant way of educating, because they all shut up then and think, okay, what is she going to say? I think education, I think the media, I don't understand the media. All they want to do is support, I don't know whether the politicians or whatever. There's such a fantastic opportunity for media to tell the story. And I believe what Imogen's saying, education's about storytelling. It's not about fact. That you can do it with facts. Don't compare our refugee arrivals with what's going to England, but compare them to how many football fans it'll be for Melbourne in the MCG. Compare the numbers of refugees arriving last year with the numbers that fit into the MCG. Australians, they relate to that sort of thing. That's what I've found, that sort of illustration works. But the public speaking and the storytelling, if you take Ahmed's stories and some of the people that were in detention, the good news stories of what they're doing now, some of the guys that you did stories on 8 years ago, go and find out where they are now. There's some fantastic good news stories. In the last 10 weeks, I don't know if you're aware, but there's been 2,000 asylum seekers released into the community. I wonder what your comments are on that, because one of you made the comment, if you can meet the person face to face, that's when the advocacy starts. And I believe that as these people are released on bridging e-visas, they're going to be rubbing shoulders. People are going to suddenly hear the stories and become more compassionate, I hope. And the best story, and I've heard, is a young boy that we've just had out of detention, a minor. It's a very, very sad story that he's had. Somebody's heard that story, they've taken it, they've followed it, they've taken him into his home, into their home. The most amazing thing about that story is that the person that has taken them in is a Liberal politician.
Can I just say to that, that's exactly what I've been trying to do. And in fact, I'm actually trying again, having tried in the past and abandoned it. And one difficulty is many people who've been in detention get out of detention, they go and make normal lives, and the last thing they want to do is to go on national television and say, oh yeah, look, that's me with my lips stitched together there in Woomera.
But they don't want that story. They want to tell their story.
Yeah, I know, but you're saying go and find the people who are in detention. They don't necessarily want to draw attention. They just want to get on with their lives, and I have actually tried to go and do that. You know, and that is a story about, well, look, these people who we demonised 10 years ago, hey, look, they're doing really well. It's quite a difficult story. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's a very difficult story to tell in a proper way, and we are trying.
I've actually just interviewed 2 boys who are ambassadors for Chill Out, and their interview is incredible. And that's Lessons Overboard. That's what I'm doing. It's self-funded. SBS, bless them, are completely supportive. But that's the difficulty, is that there are people like us who are so passionate, who quite often end up ostracised in our workplace because of it, because these stories don't necessarily get ratings which don't equate to dollars, and also because there's so much political influence in the networks. But, that again goes back to the education thing. It all goes back into that cycle, that if we start talking positively and changing the discussion and changing the narrative, then that's how we get the media on side. And it is just that cycle, but it means that, we have to kind of have more people that are prepared to be a bit rebellious and create content and put it up at their own cost is the only way around it.
Yes.
I'm Snilly from Case for Refugees in Perth. Andrew, your comments about the pragmatism in terms of Imogen's mission to educate people. What I really noticed from Imogen's speech earlier was that it's not necessarily about changing the values, because the values are already there in terms of the goodness and the compassion, and I think the stopping people from drowning issue has shown that people do care, but it's just the education in terms of how we frame the issues in the context of our values. One of the things that we've been doing at Case is looking at how we can educate the journalists, who then are able to ask the politicians or to ask the communities the issues to play with the values and play with the education and play with all of the above. And on a one-on-one basis, we've been talking to journalists and teaching them about the convention and explaining how things work and so on and so forth. What we're trying to do is figure out the best way on a bigger level to educate journalists about what the convention means and what the what the situation in Indonesia might be, what the situation in Sri Lanka might be, all of those things. But because we're not journalists, we don't know how to reach across the gap there. And I was wondering if Debbie or Imogen or anyone else had any thoughts about the best way of doing that.
Every contestant on X Factor as an ambassador. Because if that's what it comes down to. It's ratings and dollars. And unfortunately, and as far as Andrew and I go, just so we're really clear, we are actually on the same page. I really do believe that, yes, it is very difficult to change people's values. The values are there. It's just that the package that we've been fed is a lie and wrong.
It is now 7:30. We're well past time, so I think we may have to wrap up, even though I know there are more questions. Perhaps we can have a bit of a private chat afterwards. Please join me, though, in thanking our panellists for their